Hey y'all, welcome to the next installment of my Let's Build with Tailwind CSS series. This one's going to focus on extending Tailwind and including new utilities to your code base. So by default, Tailwind kind of comes with almost everything under the sun you'd really need to get up and running. There is a default template that I kind of adhere to, but then subtract from when I'm working on my own projects that comes from the GitHub repo on Tailwind. There's a stub page, I'll show you directly. Here, this is it here. If you go to Tailwind CSS on GitHub, there's a stubs folder. And inside there's a simple one, a config, and a default config. So if you just grab the contents of those, you can go ahead and just use it as is. The main purpose of this, though, isn't to really talk about that, but more or less extending it. So there's this concept of either adding your own utility classes within the primary style sheet, and or extending it to include a new plugin that we derive from a JavaScript file and so forth. So what we could do is first start with the actual class names we could add that are maybe specific to your project, whatever they be. So inside your actual Tailwind CSS file, and I should state I downloaded this playground template from Tailwind's folder too. So if you go to Tailwind CSS, the root folder or project, I guess you could say, there's a playground project here that just basically gets you up and running with Tailwind CSS from the start. You just clone it down, cdn, run yarn or npm, whatever you prefer, and just run serve. And it should go ahead and boot up a local server to get this up and running. You won't have this default config, so you'd have to go and run and get that. But it's pretty simple to find once you're already on the repo. So with all that said, I have just a basic template here without any real content in our index HTML. You'll find when you download this, it's got just a boilerplate Tailwind CSS kind of marketing style stuff. I just took that out and added some basic stuff here to get started. So the general concept I want to convey is getting actual added utilities to the stack, and I'm kind of referencing the examples on the documentation just to give you more context that you might see something that's relative to your conditions. What you could do, since I'm using literal post CSS in this case, so there's no Sass or anything, I can actually only just do CSS within this file. I couldn't do @imports like you would in Sass, but that same concept applies here. So say you're running a Sass compilation in the background, you can @import here, whatever file, import, let's say buttons or something like that. That would be fine to do right here. Now the trick is where you add these classes really matters. So in this case, you basically want to add them after the fact, never before. Before, we're getting all these directives that are going to define a reset, mount the components, and then the utilities that you basically assign in your config. So all these will actually generate during runtime or compilation time. Maybe we'll do something like the docs to get started. So like rotate classes. These aren't something you'd actually add or have by default in Tailwind. So you could say like transform. So if that runs, you'll notice I'm running this in the background. You see the changes have been detected since we're running a local server, and post CSS is running. That's all defined in the actual configuration. So if you look in the package.json file, we booted that serve command, and it's running this stuff that's relative to the node environment of development, but it's running post CSS and kind of importing a file and then outporting a file that is the Tailwind CSS that ends up in this build folder underneath here, which is eventually what gets served to that HTML file. So you'll see it's linked right here. So with all that config set up, and this is why I downloaded this project, it's already set up and ready, we can basically just extend things as we need to. So if I just add that rotate, say class rotate 90 to this random button, it works. So that's pretty cool. So that's just a quick and easy way to extend adding classes in the traditional CSS fashion, I guess you could say. So, and we'll see if 270 works. Yep, so it just rotated the other way, 180. It should just be upside down now. Yeah, cool. So I would never use that on a button, but you could use it maybe on icons or different states as you hover over them. So extending that to include the responsiveness is another concern. So what if I want those to be available on desktop, but then off on mobile or something, even though I don't know why you'd, well, maybe you would use that on mobile, but What's nice is come baked with this stuff is what's known as a directive called @responsive. And you can use this much like you would like a SAS mix-in or something like that. So you can wrap all these attributes in that, and then that will actually generate the CSS necessary to use this on the mobile too. So say we had that on class on large, we'll add rotate 180, and that's it. So say on mobile, it won't do that. It'll go back down. Notice it's back to its original state, which is pretty cool. So all that automatically happens when you add that directive into your CSS. So that's great. What comes into practice here is that this is assuming this is going to stay in your project. You aren't going to ship this anywhere else, and no one else is going to use this. So with that in mind, you might think this is completely fine, and you could do this kind of stuff as well as using variants. So before I go on here, I'll go into this too. So you could say variants instead of that responsiveness, and say hover, focus. These all come by design in this stuff. So say if you hover over one, nothing happens yet. But if I want to say that, hover, rotate 180, whoa, there it goes. So pretty cool. And then say maybe I want some transition properties too. So this transition, we'll just say like the default would be transition 0.2. I think ease is already the default there, so it'll already apply ease instead of like ease in out. So I'll just use ease. So what we could do is just add that class now to the mix. So I don't know if it'll apply to all, but yeah, in that case it does. So you see it slows it down a little bit, which is wonky, but it works. So that's pretty neat. So those are quick and easy wins, and you could just totally fly with that and it would be fine. I found that using SAS alongside this makes organization a lot easier, but you know, whatever you want to do there makes complete sense too. So I'll probably just keep these as normal. Maybe I'll do just the responsive as the main one. And I should state that this can also be done this way, so you can nest it variants. So you have both responsive, hover, and focus. So this will work on mobile and stuff too now. Okay, so like I was saying before, what if this isn't your project? Maybe you're making your own plugin to ship into the wild, like an open source thing that extends Tailwind in some way. So where you might want to go at that point is to extend to a plugin, and that actually involves writing JavaScript. So way at the bottom of my config file, there's a plugins array that accepts basically functions and allows you to hook into some properties that the author documented in such a way to let you kind of extract things into a plugin form. So what I'm thinking is creating some button classes that allow us to do this in such a way that makes buttons more componentized rather than having to write 20 classes per button. So you could do that in your CSS here and be completely fine with it, and it would work just as fine. It's probably honestly easier to update in that regard, but this way you could ship this basically config with the actual properties in the mix without having to, you know, define Tailwind in itself or custom CSS, I guess you could say. So this kind of applies the fact that maybe you're going to put this out into maybe the wild or ship it as a plugin on your own, and it's going to be something people can use on their own. So you would actually hook into this add components call, which basically this is the CSS and JS concept. So that's kind of got some buzz around it, but we'll leave that for another time. But you can define this function and destructure the object that comes back on this actual function. And this function is within the plugins array, as you see here. So within this function, we can define what the buttons would be, and it's going to be an object of nested attributes. So we'll say const buttons equals an object. And then within that, we can define our buttons. So I'll say just the base button is going to be padding and point RM. So you're writing CSS and JavaScript now, so you have to think about how that translates. So oftentimes that's going to be camel case for some properties. So border radius is one of those. So pretty much anything that's 2 words or has a hyphen is going to end up being 1 word, but camel case. So we'll just kind of follow conventions there. So this is our default button. So font weight, like I just wrote, isn't going to work. So we'd have to write it like that. And we'll set the weight to 600. So this is just defining like traditional CSS. We're not actually using Tailwind specific properties. And then we'll define maybe a blue button just to get this rolling. Or button primary, I'll call it. I don't like using the word blue per se. So that's another nested object with properties inside. That's going to be background color. And we'll call it 3490 DC. And color F. And then you could do even the hover things like you would maybe do in Sass, which is pretty cool. And we'll do a background color of 279 BD, slightly darker. Okay, and trailer commas, and then I'll do one more that's button secondary. I think I forgot that. No, that's right. So we'll just open it with a new button secondary. Background color. Oops. Let me go with like an indigo color. Define it first on, kind of stealing the colors from Tailwind, but I want to use them directly instead of their actual class names. Indigo, let's do the base, so 6. Let's jump down. And then color was white again. And then we'll do the same and hover. And then background color here will be slightly darker shade, which was something like 600. That. Cool. That's a little plugin I have for VS Code. It's kind of like an automatic prettier formatting. So I have prettier installed, and this basically just does it. You can enable it or disable it. It's kind of convenient on at least JavaScript based stuff I've found. All right, so this is the gist of where I'll go. You could extend this to be whatever you want. But after this call, after this immediate ending object on the const buttons object, we need to add that to the mix. So we've destructured this in as an object or function, and we need to call it as such. So we'll do buttons in that regard. So in theory, this should add that to our stack and see what happens. Let's see, we got this. And then if we go back into our index, if we add those classes to our buttons, button, and then I think I put button primary. Yeah, button primary. And then the same for the secondary. We should see those. So that's awesome. Very cool. So that's one way to extend it. Traditionally in Tailwind, I think pre-version 1, you could do something called @apply. That's a post-CSS specific thing, which allows you to do something similar. So let's say button tertiary. We could @apply actual, button styles in this case. So it would be, you can use the class names here. That's the cool part. So we could say background pink 500, and then color or text white, and then we'll leave it at that. And you could just say, this is traditional CSS, so you can't nest. $600, And then that should work. The problem with that is that it's going out of support soon, so I wouldn't use that, but that was traditionally what I think Tailwind shipped with initially and was suggesting that's what you'd use. The problem was, like I said, support. So going forward, you wouldn't use something as such. So let me change that to tertiary. And then we could just say rotate, so hover, rotate 180, and then it'll go nuts. So, and then transition, it'll kind of go extra nuts. Kind of a little effect there. I think I still have that class. Maybe I got rid of it. Yep, I did. So transition, we'll say ease in out for grins. And it just assumes all if you don't set it. So then you get this wonkiness going on, which is not what I would do with a button, but I'm just showing you by example there. So pretty cool stuff. That's I think the general way you would extend it or approach extending it. You can add those buttons or components as separate functions into your mix that you could add as its separate plugin. So that would be something you could just kind of add maybe as a separate repo and just bring into the mix. On top of that, there's several other functions you can hook into that essentially dictate adding or adding things to, say, the base CSS file, like here, or the base components, utilities. The docs have a lot to say about this, so maybe we can just, all these right here I'm referring to. So we just did the one that was add components, but you can add utilities too that allow you to do the same thing. And then this, inside that context, you destructure all those out. Those are already provided from the library itself, but you can come through those, add your own variants, and hook into those accordingly. The ones I'd probably use the most are the components one, just adding stuff that's going to be baked in, so you don't have to actually add the CSS in that sense. So there's basically no CSS to write ever, except for in that JavaScript initial function. Adding pseudo stuff is a different story. You would actually add variants on the fly like that. So say new utilities we added, you could add those just the same in an array format. So it's pretty neat how you can extend it and do a ton of stuff that is going to be essentially custom to your own app or a website, whatever you're using this for. So and the same rules apply for like prefixing and stuff. That all applies to everything that's scoped in between. So like he says here, all your buttons and stuff can be scoped, which is pretty cool. You don't have to really, you basically configure it once and you're done, which is the perk in my opinion. So altering base styles is pretty neat too. So maybe you don't like the default that comes with Tailwind initially, like how the way forms look or fonts, etc. Maybe for your company or product, you want to just get that declared immediately. You could, so no one can really change it, I guess, as easily. You could totally do that and just add base styles in the sense. So those would import into your base Tailwind directive here. And you could define things, just outline basically what's already defined by the theme, and then just override it in such a way so you can configure it that way. Pretty cool. I think that's about it though, guys. There's certainly further takes you could go in using this and extending your plugin. Leave that for you to kind of play with. If you want to see a take on an example plugin, you can actually require it just like you would with a node package, and then declare what kind of, say you want it responsive or hover or focus on the mix with that. So here's how you could extend it to include a full plugin suite of buttons and just kind of go to town. So I would definitely check out this repo. I'll probably link to it just to show you the examples to get you started. Adam has it all documented here, which is perfect. But there's a lot of cool stuff you can do to extend it further. That way you can maybe scope your config out to separate plugins instead of dealing with one giant config file, and or reuse this in other projects all the time. So you have your kind of, you carry around your design system kind of with you. So I'll leave that alone for now. Maybe I'll go into more depth of using one of these plugins and requiring it coming up. But I wanted to show you the concept of adding and extending Tailwind outside of the shell of the default configuration. So using plugins is a great way to do that. As you can see here, it gets kind of jarbled in the mix. So requiring this would probably make a lot more sense. It'd be another file in your actual setup or your files that you just require in as a dependency. So with that, I'll leave you, and I hope you like this. If you want more, let me know. And for now, take care. Peace. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.